then we'll take it from there.
Great.
All yours, Jeff.
Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to Your Bytes, Your Rights. We are a live weekly discussion and podcast about data ownership, digital rights, and your privacy. In episode 29, we talk about surveillance economy battlegrounds, Oracle, Kochava, and the FTC. Three sort of main talking points. Oracle, one of the largest data brokers on the planet, has had a class action lawsuit filed against it, led by Dr. Johnny Ryan and the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. Data broker Kochava is also under fire from the FTC for selling data likely to cause substantial injury to consumers. And the FTC explores rules cracking down on commercial surveillance and lax data privacy, data security practices. Pardon me. I'm Jeff Jokish, founder of Privacy Plan and a vocal privacy researcher. I live at the intersection of data privacy and at the intersection of privacy and data about privacy. I'm here with my co-host, Chris Kmeyer, managing partner at Sustany Capital. He runs a VC firm that focuses on blockchain tech, and he's into privacy, identity, and the future of money. Also, central bank digital currencies. Say hi, Chris.
Hey, and those are all the same things. Those are all just digital dust of sorts. But yeah, also I'm the amateur broadcaster responsible for messing up the broadcast continuously for the 29th time. Actually, we got it right once, so 1 out of 29s. But we'll keep working on it until we get it right, or more importantly, until we can afford someone who just does this full time. We slated someone for that. If you're listening, we cannot wait to have you here. I cannot wait to have you sitting here in the next room so that I don't have to focus on pushing buttons while I want to join the discussion.
Nice. Well, Chris, today we've got with us two distinguished panelists. John Callis, Director of Public Interest Technology at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the EFF. Say hi, John.
Hi, good to be here, and everybody gets to be freedom. We've even joked we should just change the name.
Did you change the name? I thought it was at one point, wasn't it?
No, it's Electronic Frontier.
Interesting. All right. Well, I guess I've just been saying it wrong for a while.
Yeah, and John, I don't know if you noticed that on our channel we have a variety of John Perry Barlow's famous speech that we created. Yes. So we updated it a little bit. I actually meant to send it to you because I have the full version. That's the longer version. Would love your input on that. We updated it based on like the latest technologies that John Perry obviously couldn't know about. But he's one of my personal heroes that I never got to meet.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was definitely a great person. And I enjoyed all of my interactions with him.
We also have with us today, folks, Kavya Perlman, founder and CEO of XRSI. Say hello to the audience, Kavya, and tell us a little bit about XRSI.
Hey, thanks, Jeff and Chris. Thanks for having me. I am really happy to be here, especially right off the FTC's hearing that took place yesterday. I have some insights to share, of course. But a little bit about XRSI. It's the XR Safety Initiative. It's a nonprofit standard developing organization dedicated to building safety, privacy, security, ethical standards in emerging technology ecosystems. Sometimes we've even been called as the EFF for the metaverse. Which is quite a compliment, to be honest. We've been around just about 3 years and just been in a very research mode to investigate issues pertaining to privacy, security, and safety. We launched a novel cybersecurity rooted framework. It's called XRSI Privacy and Safety Framework for extended reality and metaverse related technologies.
That's excellent. For some people that may not know some of the lingo, what you're talking about is sort of privacy, security, safety that applies to like the metaverse and augmented reality, extended reality, sort of like all of those other realities, right? Maybe sort of beyond just Web 2.0. Is that what you're talking about?
That's correct. Anytime you use technology to extend your reality into another dimension, that I consider extended reality. It's kind of like an umbrella term. It includes augmented reality, like your Facebook or Insta filters. Sometimes you overlay a digital object on top of your reality. When you do that, you have extended your reality. You can do that with audio too, augmented audio, spatial audio, etc. But it gets really, really interesting when we talk about virtual reality, because now you use these sort of devices that sort of take over your entire view, and then you're in this fully coded, digitally created reality. And then when that happens, there are so many questions of ethical concerns and privacy concerns, because some of these realities are only possible with the use and collection and processing of real-time data at the almost at the level of biometric and all kinds of stuff. So it gets really interesting real fast and really scary too sometimes. I have to be really careful not to go into too dystopic direction, but it inevitably leads to.
Absolutely. Well, I think we'd like to talk some more about that. I don't know how much time we're going to have. We should tell the viewers that you've got to leave a little bit early here. But so, in light of that, let's sort of get into our first topic. I want to talk about the FTC surveillance form that we mentioned at the top of the hour. You were able to give some public commentary for a couple of minutes. We were going to try to pop your video up, but we aren't able to do that. Can you tell us a little bit about what you told the FTC yesterday?
For sure, and I don't know if you have a screen share function. I'm happy to play that video for you guys if that's something that you're looking to do.
Yeah, you should be able to do that.
Okay.
Let me make sure. I might need to make you the co-host. So I make you the co-host. Here you go. And that should work, presumably.
Okay, so I know we're kind of doing this on the fly. This is kind of what happened yesterday. I had sort of shown up, and I'm just going to pull this off of my LinkedIn. Commissioners and FTC staff members. We live in a time when the harms to consumers go beyond compromising of personal data that harms credit or even job prospects. Today, we must consider that the risks involve human beings, their welfare, and their existence. For this reason, FTC efforts to protect Americans from the practices of collecting, analyzing, and monetizing user data need to go from mere protection of information to prevention of harm, and further to ensure safety by design. We're moving from a post-truth to a post-reality era of constant reality capture. Seeing is no longer believing. I'm Javier Berman, founder and CEO of XR Safety Initiative, XRSI. We are a standard evolving organization with a mission to help build safety and inclusion in emerging technology ecosystems like the metaverse. We build privacy, safety, and ethics standards such as the novel XRSI Privacy and Safety Framework. On behalf of over 150 advisors, the entire XRSI team, we urge you to, number one, introduce special data type considerations for inferred data associated with virtual reality, augmented reality, newer technologies, and the metaverse technologies to correctly identify data classifications and appropriate security and privacy statuses. Number two, include anti-competitive data consolidation practices and the use of privacy-intensive technologies. Number three, ban coding for addictive engagement for all consumers, but especially on young people or those under 18. The FEC has an opportunity to address these risks proactively. So I'll just stop there, John, Jeff and Chris, because it sort of captures those three big points that I wanted to highlight to FTC, and one that I didn't hear any of the participants and panelists say, and I'm glad that we exist. We really needed to ensure that addictive engagement, coding for addictive engagement, cannot be allowed for children, especially for augmented, virtual, mixed reality, the emerging technologies, because they're so sophisticated, there's so much data on humans that, and plus the intersection of artificial intelligence, we're really going to lose that battle. So now is the time to put some moratorium on those things, and I'm really glad that FTC is paying attention and asking for inputs that require these type of intervention.
Yeah, I mean, I was a little shocked about the sophistication of the discussion yesterday as a technologist focusing on that space, because we have identified this topic over a decade ago, right? So, and that's why I also really don't appreciate when they call these things advertising, for example. Google and the other companies have not been selling advertising for over a decade. That's not what they do. What they do is they sell social engineering as a service solution, because obviously they don't care if the outcome of using their tools is that people don't vote or change their opinion on things, or if people buying a product, right? So to call that advertising is just not the correct label. We need to make sure that we call this the right thing and call it what it is, because social engineering is the primary form of hacking. Mm-hmm. And that this should exist as a business model is just flabbergasting to me.
You're literally on the point. In fact, 2016, I was working for Facebook doing third-party security advisory during Cambridge Analytica time. And that's when I devised and proposed this term called cyber political engineering. It is literally the form of social engineering that you unleash on an entire nation.
Right.
All that, and then that could potentially influence lots of minds to vote one way or the other. Facebook interprets it as, they term it as information operations. In fact, they lean on something called as coordinated inauthentic behavior, CIBs. From a cybersecurity perspective, cybersecurity folks worry about advanced persistent threats that are hard to manage. But in this era, like CIBs, the coordinated inauthentic behavior, those are some things. So these, like the privacy territory crosses with security and the safety so much. That's why, at XRSI, we really kind of look at it from a safeguarding the ecosystem. And that's why the extended reality safeguarding the safety.
What you brought up another interesting point, Kavya, and maybe John can weigh in on this a little bit. Inferred data. When we talk a lot about personal data, we never really get into the details of what personal data is, and sort of consumers never really get to this point, right? But there's a lot of different types of personal data. Maybe they get to the level of understanding that there's personal data and there's sensitive personal data, but they generally don't take that taxonomy any further and think about the types of data that you directly give to a company versus the kind of personal data they collect about you, versus the type of data that they infer about you, and there's other types as well. But that inferred data is really powerful, and that's the type of data specifically that they try to keep out of privacy legislation. Do you care to comment about that, John, or Kavya as well?
Well, that is one of the things that is a huge issue. It's really that a bunch of these services are being paid for with our data, and that's brass tacks. We ought to recognize that. And the data, that every bit of data that we give up becomes worth more the more they get up, because that's where they can do things that are inferring behavior and so on, because they can look at trends and collections of things that go together. Just like if you look at somebody's bookshelf, you can learn an awful lot about them by what sort of books they have. And when we get to things like XR, we've been doing work on this as well. And one of the issues, for example, is that there are a lot of devices that I've been calling intimate devices, which include things like wearables. It's like, it's like I have a smartwatch that is periodically checking my heart rate, temperature, all sorts of other things. And so it knows an awful lot about me. And if you're wearing an XR device, one of the things that they're building is being able to do eye tracking, where there's a lot of really good reasons to do eye tracking, and they include the fact that if you want to have very good video, we really only see very well in the center of what we look at. So the peripheral of what we're looking at could be done in lower resolution, and you could get better video by essentially rendering right where your eyes are going and less well at your periphery. But that also gives them an insight into your mind. An example that I've given is, imagine that you're in the metaverse, you're walking down a hallway, and it's got billboards on the side of it, or there are shop fronts on the side of it. The place where your eyes light to start telling you various things about what you are interested in, because you look at the things that are more interesting to you longer than the other things. So they can tell just by presenting an ad to you and you not clicking on it, what's interesting to you and what's not. And that's why, for example, to like what Kavya is saying, we should make sure that that sort of data stays on the device and does not go into the platform where they can analyze it.
Yeah, and if they're tracking your heartbeat, right, or other emotional indicators and trying to infer that about you, how can they weaponize that? I mean, maybe that's okay I don't know that it's okay, but maybe it's okay for selling things, but when they start to try to influence your behavior based upon that, that starts to get really scary.
Yeah, a lot of that is, there's a lot of pseudoscience behind it, and I believe that is another one of the dangers, because they're also wanting to do things like emotion detection and so on, which are in fact basically impossible. And just like you can't really read somebody's emotions by just looking at them, if you get an increased heart rate, they know that they got you animated, but they don't necessarily know the cause behind it. But they will make inferences, and the correct ones and the incorrect ones are equally dangerous, just in different directions.
Right.
So I know we're talking about inferences. One of the things that needs to happen, and this is something that XRSI researched on heavily, is we created a terminology for it, because this needs to go into the law. GDPR, just a couple of weeks ago, like last month, I believe, expanded the sensitive data to include now inferences. But here's the gap that I want to highlight is sensitive data, the context. What is that? Like which metadata are you saying is allowed or not allowed? So we came up with a terminology called biometrically inferred data. Biometrically inferred data, just like John said, pupil dilation, how you blink your eyes, etc. It could be way more things, but inferring things out of it. In fact, real quick, I'm just gonna point the screen to this particular visual that speaks, picture says 1,000 words kind of thing. All these possible inferences are just possible from the eyes. Cognitive processes, how level of sleepiness, skills and abilities, mental health. This is available on XRSI website with the taxonomy page. But now this inference, so we need to contextualize, quantify, like, hey, what kind of gate data, biometrical inferred data, gate data, could lead to these type of, this could lead to several harm, discriminatory harm, economic harm. We go to Daniel Solov's taxonomy for privacy harms. This is literally like a gold mine to really, go further down into. So that's what we need to see. We need to see this biometrically inferred data categorically called out in those privacy legislations, and Europe is actually starting to do that. A lot of the people are reaching out to just sort of adopt this taxonomy, and I hope that we go away from this vague, sensitive data. We need to get more granular, and only then the legislations like that would have teeth into. And that's what, that's what I would say. And it goes way beyond eye tracking. We're conducting some research on AR authentication, so even smell, all five senses could infer so much. And then anything that human produces, EKG, EMG, all this stuff is like biometrically inferred data.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of stuff with voice that's pretty scary.
Yeah, but I have a question for John, and that's something we've been coming across quite a bit. I think it's an exercise in futility to talk about privacy at all. I think people's eyes glare over when they hear or read the term privacy. It doesn't interest them. It's a box that they check, that they have been conditioned to check when they enter into a website, so to speak. So the larger point there being is, for me, this has to do with human agency and something else. I think we need to find simply a better term for that gets people's attention, because really what these things are commercial psyops, right? So this is really what government agencies do to overthrow governments. They influence the population at scale to change the behavior at scale, and we have allowed that to exist as a business model. And to me, that has nothing to do with privacy. That's like a tertiary at best consideration. This has to do with freedom and human agency, right?
I think that's exactly what we should be phrasing it as, because privacy really is a meaningless word. And it's meaningless because we use it as a shorthand for so many things. Immediately, I will say Kochava is doing exactly the right thing, that they're producing a taxonomy of things like CID, which we can really talk about, and we can talk about it as a category, and we can talk about it as different items. But as a category, we can point out that different bits of data can be put together to produce things that are not immediately apparent that you could. I mean, for example, let's take location data. You would think that if you gave somebody your location to 1 mile, that's pretty harmless. Well, they can infer by where you are at 2 a.m. that that's very likely where you live. And they can infer from where you are at 2 p.m. that that's very likely where you work. And one of the somewhat shocking things about de-anonymizing data is that knowing somebody's home and place of work each to 1 mile resolution will uniquely identify like 85% of all people in the US. And so you would think that telling somebody where you work, who already knows where you live, would be not necessarily giving away who you were, but they could very likely put together just those 2 items and figure out uniquely who you are. Similarly, other things, as they put this other stuff together, they can start slicing down by adding stuff up together, who you are, what your preferences are, political affiliation, and so on. So it really is a psyops thing, as you were saying. Just by doing things like, figuring out which books attract your attention more, and then doing further refinements to tell whether or not it's a positive attraction or a negative attraction. Did you focus on it because you liked it or because it made you mad? And by narrowing these things down, we can become uniquely identified, and they can start to build up profiles of who we are. So absolutely, this is a huge problem and something that's difficult to talk about. And SRI and other people are doing a fine job of letting us be able to talk about this in ways that is useful to the regulators.
That's nice. um, I know you've got to go soon, Kavya. Are there solutions to this problem other than the taxonomy pieces that you're building, um, that John sort of just highlighted as well?
Well, yesterday is a part of the solution. Yesterday, what we saw with the FTC hearing, Lena Khan leading the charge on these aspects and listening to everybody is a part of the solution. But here's what was a little bit lacking. Every time people were asked, like, how do we operationalize this? How do we actually make sure that this, like, actually gets some the legislation and then compensation of harm. No, 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 no. We need to go into prevention mode. We need to shift this responsibility onto engineering, that coding, etc. So in order to do that, we really need a framework. And that's kind of what XRSI has been working on. So when we work on these research and framework, this framework captures things like, and I'm going to credit our CyberXR president, Noble Ackerson, for this framework: context, control, choice, and then there is autonomy and respect. He really just puts it as 3C plus R framework. So how do you address privacy in the era of constant reality capture? You demand, hey, I need context for what you're going to use my data. I need to be able to have a choice if you're going to use that much data, this much data. Should I use the service or should I not? Maybe I use with little context. But then context, choice, and control. I've got to be able to control where my data is going, where all my data is going. But we go beyond that because privacy is just like, it's not just anonymity and context, control, choice. We demand respect, which leads to prevention of harm for autonomy, because companies should lead responsibly, innovate responsibly, and that's when respect comes in. That's when neural rights come in. That respect is literally demanding, hey, you will not just take my brain spectrum or these all these inferences. You will respect my autonomy, you will respect my agency, and you will respect my free will. And that needs to be codified. So yesterday was a great day because we not only had the FTC forum, we also had some words come out from White House about the accountability measures from some of the listening sessions that happened. And then the third thing was um, United Nations Human Rights Commission adopted some of this research work for neural rights. So new things are coming about. So yesterday was quite an incredible day where all these three, four big, massive agencies were just honing in on these ideas. And I think that's collectively is what needed. I think your role is quite important in all this awareness. People need to be aware of what's happening to us. How are we being manipulated? Because despite what we do, build the frameworks, legislation, there is still going to be that residual harm, in which case people need to know how to stay protected, how to prepare their children for these new realities. So I do have to jump off, but thank you for having me. And I could so relate to technology fail. That's what happened with me yesterday. The video froze, but I was using this deep fake setup, and I'm really thankful for you to letting me play that video and share it widely with the viewers. Yeah, really appreciate you all. And
Thank you.
thank you, John, as well.
Thank you, Kavya.
Thanks, Kavya.
Yeah, so I propose a shortcut, and I'm going to run this by John to see what he thinks about that. I, for the longest time, have been thinking, why do we not apply the same standards that we apply to the government to private companies? As in, if you want to track and surveil me, well, then you need a warrant. it's
Yeah.
it's the same requirement. Like by virtue of you being a private company, why do you get to do things that the government couldn't do? I don't see a justification for that.
Well, I would say, businesses and government are not the same, and it is dangerous in both directions to conflate the two of them together, because a business cannot throw you in prison. Businesses have increasing amounts of power, particularly when it is very difficult to do things like, it's difficult to live in this world without a mobile phone. And if you don't have a mobile phone, you're cut off from all sorts of things. So they have a lot of power, but it's not the same thing, and we shouldn't conflate them together. And with the government, not only do they have to have a warrant, but there are specific things that are out of bounds, because there are such things as unallowed searches, and they have to show probable cause. Um, and so this is a very different thing when it comes to warrants, to when it comes to your voluntarily giving it up. But it also suggests one of the things that we're seeing about the data brokers, which is the alliances between law enforcement and businesses. We've been doing work on that and have some things on EFF website about fog data. We did that with AP News, and absolutely, the government should not be allowed to buy data that they would need a warrant to collect. So that's one of the basic things that we need to worry about. What the other thing, which is what we restrict the companies on, has its own set of different thorny issues that we need to work through. And I think it's dangerous to conflate the two of them, because businesses and governments are not the same.
Sure. I mean, I was being slightly facetious because obviously I get your point. I was a lawyer in a previous life, but your point is also well taken. I think most people don't realize that by basically all these companies tracking you entirely, you're kind of handing over all your personal life warrantless to the government incidentally, because it's not like this data is tainted by virtue of not having this warrant requirement attached to it at the time it was created, right? So typically, to me, it would fall under like the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine, but because at the time the data was created, there was no warrant in place for this data to be collected. It should be inadmissible, it should be inaccessible, right? And again, for a lot of people immediately jump to that idea, well, then criminals are running free and whatnot. That is utter nonsense, right? Because really what we're trying to do is protect the innocents, because most people that are a target of these types of surveillance attacks are actually the innocent. It's not the criminals. So they know better, right? So
well, and that is precisely why we have rights. Is that that's the reason why rights exist. And it is that the vast majority of us are not doing that. And there should be a reason for them to be able to look for something. And that's why we have warrants. Yeah. And that's it's a thing in and of itself.
Jeff, should we move on to the Oracle thing? Otherwise we have to change the show title.
Yeah, exactly. I think we need, well, and this is a pretty good intro to that, right? So you started talking about how data brokers are sort of facilitating, law enforcement's access to data. So let's talk a little bit more about those data brokers. They're sort of under fire now, for good reason. A lot of people don't like them, us especially. And now Oracle is in a little bit of hot water because they've got a large class action lawsuit against them. So let's talk about that a little bit. Oracle tracks about 5 billion people. That's actually as of, I think, 2018, so like 5 years ago.
5 billion? You said 5 billion?
5 billion.
Individuals?
Yeah. So individuals, right?
And there's 8 billion people on the planet, so we'll track more than half.
I'm sure it's more like 6 billion now. They've got subsidiaries like Blue Kai and Data Logic and AddThis and OnRamp, so they've been buying up a lot of businesses. So I'm sure it's more than 5 billion now. But the lawsuit that's against them essentially complains under about 5 different statutes. Essentially an invasion of privacy under the California Constitution, an intrusion upon seclusion, which is essentially California common law privacy tort, right? Violation of unfair competition, which is an interesting one. They're essentially saying that they're enriching themselves based upon your data, which is an interesting argument. There's also two different essentially wiretap laws: the ECPA law that they say they're violating, as well as California's version of that, the California Invasion of Privacy Act. And so those are essentially the arguments they're making. And I think it's actually a pretty decent lawsuit. But of course, most of these things don't turn on how good your arguments are, but more nuanced things. And I don't know whether this lawsuit actually has a good chance of winning or losing. So that's one of the reasons we have somebody like John on to maybe give us a little better insight. So, John, any thoughts on this? Are any of these legal arguments good arguments?
I think a lot of it depends upon where they are in things. Certainly, some of the direct privacy things are interesting and I think are covered by it. But this would be the sort of case that could turn things around and by implication create more rights for us and restrictions on the companies, just like we've seen with things like air pollution, noise abatement in years past. I don't think that the wiretap ones, but I'm not a lawyer. It's like I can kind of see that you would go there, but those laws were not intended to regulate that. And there's other things where a bunch of the things that we are doing are perfectly reasonable until they get automated by a computer. I mean, for example, we all support the rights. Excuse me just a moment.
Sure. Yeah, I think sort of where you're going a little bit, John, is maybe almost sort of like the Supreme Court's mosaic argument, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
And, we all support the right of being able to take a picture. Nobody wants to restrict the rights of people to take selfies of themselves in front of landmarks. And I have seen estimates that if you walk in just about any city across a city, down a city block, your picture will be taken 10 times. And this just happens, and you can see it when things happen like, oh, there's a plane crash, and it turns out that somebody happens to have their cell phone pointed in the right direction at the time that it happened. So the fact that these show up all the time tell us how many times that we are unknowingly in other cameras. But if somebody takes a picture and then they take a picture once a minute and then they take a picture continuously and then they have a machine learning algorithm that's doing face recognition and then they have something like Clearview that is identifying it from a database of real persons, at some point you have crossed from, oh, this is completely okay, to what the heck are you doing, stop that now. And and we could debate where we cross the line, but as you have more of these things going with AI systems and machine learning in place, it becomes intrusive at some point. And I think the lawsuit is going to do exactly what we were talking about when I mentioned being able to just assimilate location data and these other things like AI systems that are processing and surveilling things that would not have otherwise been surveilled, that it turns into an abusive practice at some weird point, and the courts are going to have to decide where that is, or the legislators are going to have to do that, and and ultimately that will end up being a lawsuit of some sort as well.
I think about when the the Berlin Wall came down and people started getting access to like Stasi files, you know, these big files on individual people, and I can't help making a comparison to like, you know, I guess Oracle, but like Axiom files that have purportedly like 10,000 data points on an individual consumer. How is that different, right? I mean, if they've got files that are that complete on an individual person, does that not scare the hell out of people? Um, and how is it so much different? Okay, yeah, it's not a government, and maybe they're not using it to arrest you at this point in time, but is that not invasive? You know,
it is invasive, and I would prefer not to compare things to the repressive government secret police, because they are completely different. And there are aspects of this which include things like when we have laws that are very different in very different places, because we are already seeing this post-Dobbs, where this trend happened starting with legalization of cannabis, where you would have dramatically different laws in different states, that different types of health care are going to be a constitutional right in one state and a felony in another. And that has great implication to the data brokers, because it does not quite but gesture towards the extreme circumstances that you're talking about, where it would have law enforcement consequences. But this gets us to, they should be collecting less data, and they should be using their data and getting rid of it. That we know that raw data has a very short half-life. And part of this comes from things like, you know, let's go back into things that are reasonably harmless. Like, you know, if you want to binge watch a whole bunch of superhero movies, and then you might decide, no, I'm gonna watch spy movies. When you change what you are interested in watching, that past stuff about you is now worthless, because you're no longer interested in superhero movies, you're interested in spy movies. And this is why data that they collect is something that they ought to not just keep around, they ought to be getting rid of it, because there is no even business use for it. And there's even an anti-business use for it, that when it comes to things like advertisements even, I mean, we all know that the predictive ability of advertisers is extraordinarily low. I mean, you know, the old saw about advertising is that somebody says, I'm wasting half the money I spend on it, I just don't know which half. And the data is coming out of this targeted advertising that it simply does not even work. And anecdotally, we all know that it works. I mean, it doesn't work. That rarely do I ever get an advertisement of something before I buy it. After I buy it, yes.
Yeah.
That's so true.
Yeah.
You bought a car, maybe you'd like to buy 5 more.
Yes.
So true. Let's move on. Unless you've got anything to add, Chris, let's move on to the Kochava lawsuit. So
Well, I was just going to add, I think defaults matter a lot, right? I think the default expectation of a person is that certain behavior is not being observed by everybody, and they would be very surprised to learn later this was observed and stored and shared, right? And so hence, if I'm surprised, well, I'm not surprised, but as I said, most people would be. So if we ask 100 people and 90 people of those are surprised that this particular data is being collected and shared, then we should just reverse the default and say, no, this data should not be collected and shared, right? It's as easy as that, right?
I'm a firm believer that things ought to be opt-in, not opt-out.
Right. So
shouldn't you have the agency to fix that too, right? So if you're no longer interested in those movies, can't you just turn that off? You know, I mean,
Why should I have to?
Right.
Well, I would agree with that, but if it is there, shouldn't it be visible so that you could at least know it's there and turn it off? I'm not saying
Sure.
that, yeah, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we all know that these things don't work very well,
Right.
and there are reports coming out of ad tech which are showing that there are many problems with advertising technology that for example, advertisers are paying like 4x for favorable audiences that will only get them 4% greater engagement at most. And that raises the question of, are the advertisers engaging in fraudulent behavior with the people even buying their ads, let alone the fraudulent behavior with us? And I think that this gets us directly into Kochava, what the FTC does, because the FTC mandate is for unfair and deceptive. So a flat out unfair practice they can and have banned. And there are all sorts of things that I like to look at histories of these things, because when you think about, well, can the FTC do it? And then you go and say, well, actually, in the 1940s and 60s, the FTC did this like 8 times, then of course the FTC can do it because they did it. And how that applies to the information economy is different. 30 years ago, when EFF started, we were definitely, most of us, saying we have no idea what the internet is going to be, so let's take all of the rules off of it, because there's a tendency for us to shape things to our worst fears. And so we're probably better off by not regulating it a lot. And I think that now we've reached the point where obviously it all needs to be regulated, and what we are arguing is what parts need to be regulated and how, for reasons like we knew 30 years ago that, for example, television broadcasting was dominated by 3 players. Social media is dominated by 3 players. So basically what we've done is we've created ABC, NBC, and CBS for Facebook, Twitter, and Google.
It's true.
And what that means is that we have to go and look at it and say that our grand dreams about how the internet world was going to be different didn't pan out. We got the same thing, only different.
Yeah.
Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. So what do we do that's different? How do we change things so that we don't simply end up with a thing of we knock these giants off the pedestal and get new giants on new pedestals?
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest question that we have to do, is not only how do we get out of this mess, and how do we not just repeat the problems of the past?
Yeah, in my mind, we just need to treat everything that's in digital space the same way we treat it in meat space. We have all the rights and laws that we need. We are not enforcing that. So that's why we talked a little bit about this before the show, and that's why we chose the title for the show, Your Bytes, Your Rights. To me, all my digital dust belongs to me. You don't get to break into my house and take notes of what books are on my shelf, right? In the same point in time, whatever ebook I'm buying, quote unquote, you should also not get to observe without me giving you a written paper that says you get to do that, right? So that I think we are thinking about that, not we, but regulators at large don't think about this in the right way. Regulators want to regulate. It's the man with the hammer kind of scenario, right? So regulation almost always just leads to regulatory capture. You're enshrining the incumbents and you double down the mistakes of the past, right? So that's the wrong thing, right? So it's the wrong people talking usually. Who we need to let talk is the actual technologists. And then people that are responsible for certain outcome in meat space using digital technologies need to be held accountable. We need to build the agency attribution layer for digital solutions so that we can hold people accountable for these outcomes. So simple example would be how much time is wasted on a daily basis just by people being social engineered and paying attention to some nonsense, right? So if you take Facebook's numbers and just round them up, if there's 100 million Americans spending an hour on Facebook every day, how much of that is taking out of productivity? How much that is actually damages to a commercial business at scale? I would argue that's much more than Facebook's revenue, even at minimum wage, if we hold them accountable for that. That should not happen. That should be impossible, right? So I don't get to walk into a company and swing some advertising in front of people and distract them from doing their actual work. So I don't see a difference, right?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and and I'll push back a little bit and say that before things were going on with Facebook, CNN did an awful lot of it too, because there were lots of places where I worked where the break room, etc., would have a TV on and the sound would be off, but the closed caption would be underneath it, and it permitted a company to project itself into another company's view. And why, yes, indeed, the web changes a lot of that. And I would also not want to frame it solely as a productivity thing. That I don't. One of the things that we have not done very well is try to pretend that we are all perfectly spherical, frictionless economic actors, and we're not.
Yeah. So the point that there being is, you can correct me if I'm wrong on my memory here, but we created .com specifically for commercial content to live, right? And that's where it should live. And so as such, everything else should be free of this commercial driven approach. So if I'm a company and I don't want my employees, let's say, to access that particular layer of the web during business hours, right, for whatever reason, then that should be an easy choice. And we should create these gates. It's not like I cannot drag you into a store, right? So if I'm a merchant and you're walking by, I cannot just drag you into a store and make you look at stuff, right? But
So why is it the bosses are saying you can't look at Facebook at work? And do we really want to have these sorts of things that make it easier for bosses to make the workplace more unpleasant? Because I mean, realistically, we all have devices that we carry with us. I mean, it's like I could go into work and I could turn Wi-Fi off my phone and I could do Facebook on my phone while I'm at work, and work doesn't know that I'm doing it. So this is where the be careful what you're doing, because if people want to look at social media at work, then they'll do so and they'll figure out how to do it. There's also the very real issue that there isn't a clear boundary. And there really isn't a clear boundary between social media and what's going on, because there are things that are not precisely social media. I mean, for example, Telegram is both a communication messenger, kind of like WhatsApp, and one of the huge social media networks that Americans don't use, but a lot of other people do.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm just expecting people to protect themselves first. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the larger point, and that's going to be part of my end of the show rant, because we're 1 minute at the top of the hour. So to me, the success of our species, right? And most people should remember that most species died out, right? So life is a fluke. And we haven't made it very far yet. But the reason that we made it as far as we did is because humans learned to collaborate. And the primary tool for collaboration is language. And so now what we allowed, though, is we created technologies for the distribution of language, and then we let commercial interest and otherwise third-party interest seep into that communication channel. And my thesis is that's why you're seeing this diversion on, like in the real world, where blue people cannot marry red people. That's out of the question now. And otherwise wars break out for things that are entirely benign, right? When human survival is at stake. And I'm not being hyperbolic. To me, it's a certainty on current trajectory that we will be extinct because of what we are doing, because of our ability or inability to collaborate. And corporations are just a form of cooperating, and that's a subset of the same thing. That's why I brought that up. Ultimately, I think we are working on finding better ways of capital formation, but that's where I'm coming from. So that's kind of my life's objectives. That's what I will do for the next decade or two, but I want to do it in a practical way. So we are not doing these shows to vent. We're doing this for a meeting of the minds. We need diversity in thinking. We need to have people from different tribes, from different disciplines, look at the same problem, come to the same conclusions, that these particular things are problems that can be solved, because they can be solved, right? We now have the cryptographic primitives to create peer-to-peer end-to-end encryption, to not let this information be polluted, right? Anyway, end of rant here, because we had a talk, but you have the last word.
Yeah, I would love to have another conversation to talk about some of these things, because, for example, I worked on what turned into social media and other things. We called it social virtual reality in the early 90s. And it was a combination of all of the things that we've talked about, from hardware to software and so on. And at that time, there was no SSL, and we decided that we needed something, and that caused my sharp right turn of a career into encryption and other things from this. And there are lots of things that we learned in the 1980s about how to build virtual communities, that the documentation exists, and human beings are still the same, and they are observations about human beings. And many of the social media that we have are flat out badly designed.
Yes.
And since I am a designer, I would love to talk about how would we build something that worked well? How would we build a social media that would permit communication and collaboration and de-escalation of conflict, as opposed to the others? Because in the 80s and 90s, that is in fact what we were trying to do, was figure out how we build things that bring people together, but the raw commercial aspects of it, which in many cases it was merely just a let's grow this as fast as we can, and anything that makes more people use it is good, that design center produced something that isn't very good, and we could build something that is better. So looking at it in terms of saying, fine, let's just start with the world is a mess. How would you go rebuild social media to make it better would be a great discussion to have.
Yeah. And yeah, I call it, maybe we should create that show. I call it social engineering for good. I want to have digital tools that engineer me into living a happier, healthier, better, smarter life, right? And I'm designing these tools for myself, like for my workout schedule, for my nutrition schedule. I have to design these tools myself. I test all these tools, and they're all infected with that same capital formation idea that tries to redirect my eyeballs and make me buy nonsense, right? But that's exactly what I'm asking for. And the thing is, you can make much more money on that, right? It's kind of healthcare versus sick care type of thing. It's like, if I have a solution that social engineers me into living a healthier life, well, I can build this into my insurance, and I can be better off. I can be happier, and I will gladly pay for that. Give me that, right? So people will subscribe to that if that's the outcome, right? So I really don't understand it. Like, I don't understand why Google doesn't allow you to build your own search engine and set your objectives. That's the point. You want to set, like with every other tool, I always liken it to, you're buying a car and the car decides where you're going. That makes no sense. Right? We would not do that with a car. Why do we do this with your quote-unquote search engine? Not that Google is a search engine. That's just a lie. It's not a search engine. You're not searching anything. Yeah, end of the second rant. We are over time, and I'm late to my next call. So, Jeff, you'll lead us out, and I'll hope to see everybody next week.
I will. I've got some thoughts on Kochava that I'll share in a separate post, maybe in the show notes as well. But this has been really wonderful. This has been Your Bytes, Your Rights, episode 29, Surveillance Economy Battlegrounds with John Callis and Kavya Perlman. Join us next week for our 30th episode, where we talk about the unprivacy of employee data.